Rollins, Dallas, Texas. The Steam House by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. First Stages. Before dawn, on the morning of our start, I left the Spencer Hotel, one of the best in Calcutta, which I had made my residence ever since my arrival. The great city was by this time quite familiar to me. Morning promenades before the heat became unbearable, evening drives on the Strand as far as the Esplanade or Fort William, where the splendid equipages of the English whirl scornfully past the not less splendid carriages of the great fat native baboos, expeditions through the curious streets of shops, which are very appropriately called bazaars, visits to the burial grounds on the banks of the Ganges, to the Botanic Gardens, the work of the great naturalist Hooker, and to Madame Colly, the horrible four-armed woman who, as a fierce goddess of death, is enshrined in a small temple where modern civilization and native barbarism are exhibited side by side. All this I had done. I had gazed at the vice-regal palace opposite the Spencer Hotel, admired the curious buildings on the Chowringhee Road, and the town hall, dedicated to the memory of the great men of our time, studied in detail the interesting mocks of the Hoogly, gone over the harbor crowded by the finest vessels of the English merchant service, made the acquaintance of the adjutants, those singular birds known by a variety of names, whose vocation it is to act as scavengers and preserve the city in a perfectly salubrious condition. And all this being accomplished, I had now nothing to do but to take my departure. Accordingly, on the 6th of May, a wretched vehicle with 2 horses and 4 wheels, called a palki-gari, a machine unfit to be seen beside comfortable English-built carriages, came to convey me to the door of Colonel Munro's bungalow. Our train awaited us at no great distance. We had only to enter and establish ourselves. Our luggage had of course been put on board. Nothing unnecessary was allowed, but Captain Hood had large ideas in the matter of firearms, and considered an arsenal of 4 Enfield rifles, 4 fowling pieces, 2 duck guns, and several other guns, pistols, and revolvers quite indispensable for such a party as ours. This armory appeared to threaten the lives of wild beasts rather than simply to supply game for our table, but the Nimrod of our expedition was very decided in his views on the subject. Captain Hood was in the highest spirits. The triumph of having succeeded in persuading Colonel Munro to forsake his solitary retreat, the pleasure of setting out on such a tour with an equipage so entirely novel, the prospect of unusual occupation, plenty of exercise, and grand Himalayan excursions, all combined to excite him to the greatest degree, and he gave vent to his feelings in perpetual exclamations while he urged us to bestir ourselves. The clock struck the hour of departure. Steam was up, the engine ready for action. Our engine-driver stood at his post, his hand on the regulator. The whistle sounded. "Off with you, behemoth!" shouted Captain Hood, waving his cap. And this name, so well suited to our wonderful traction engine, was ever after bestowed upon it. Now for a word as to our attendants who occupied the second house, number 2, as we used to call it. The engine-driver, Storr, was an Englishman, and had been employed on the Great Southern Line until a few months previously. Banks knew him to be an efficient and clever workman, thoroughly up to his business, and therefore engaged him for Colonel Munro's service. He was a man of 40 years of age, and proved exceedingly useful to us. The fireman's name was Kalauth. He belonged to a tribe or class of Hindus much sought after by railway companies, to be employed as stokers, because they endure with impunity the double heat of their tropical climate and that of the engine furnaces. They resemble in this the Arabs employed as firemen in the Red Sea steamers, good fellows who are content to be merely boiled where Europeans will be roasted in a few minutes. Colonel Munro had a regimental servant named Gomi, one of the tribe of Gorkhas. He belonged to that regiment which, as an act of good discipline, had accepted the use of the Enfield rifles, the introduction of which into the service had been the reason, or at least the pretext, of the Sepoy revolt. Small, active, supple, and of tried fidelity, Gomi always wore the dark uniform of the Rifle Brigade, which was as dear to him as his own skin. Sergeant McNeill and Gomi were attached heart and soul to Colonel Munro. They had fought under his command all through the Indian campaign. They had accompanied him in his fruitless search for Nana Sahib. They had followed him into retirement and would never dream of leaving him. But Captain Hood also had a faithful follower, a frank, lively young Englishman whose name was Fox, and who would not have changed places with any officer's servant under the sun. He perfectly adored Captain Hood, and was quite as keen a sportsman as his master. Having accompanied him on numberless tiger hunts, Fox had proved his skill and reckoned the tigers which had fallen to his gun at 37, only 3 less than his master could boast of. Our staff of attendants was completed by a negro cook, whose dominion lay in the forepart of the second house. He was of French origin, and having boiled, fried, and fricasseed in every possible latitude, Monsieur Perizard, for that was his name, had no small opinion of the importance of his noble profession. He would have scorned to call it his trade. He presided over his saucepans with the air of a high priest, and distributed his condiments with the accuracy of a chemist. Monsieur Perizard was vain, it is true, but so clever that we readily pardoned his vanity. Our expedition, then, was made up of 10 persons, namely, Sir Edward Munro, Banks, Hood, and myself, who were accommodated in one house, McNeill, Storr, Calouth, Gomi, Fox, and Monsieur Perizard in the other. I must not forget the 2 dogs, Fan and Niger, whose sporting qualities were to be put to the proof by Hood in many a stirring episode of the chase. Bengal is perhaps, if not the most curious, at least the richest of the 3 Indian presidencies. It is now, properly speaking, the country of the Rajahs, which lies more especially in the centre of the vast empire, but the province extends over a district the dense population of which may be considered essentially Hindu. The route we proposed to take would lead us obliquely across this district, which to the extreme north is bounded by the insurmountable barriers of the Himalaya chain. After some discussion, it was finally proposed that, having travelled up the banks of the Hooghly for some leagues, the Hooghly being that branch of the river Ganges which passes through Calcutta, we should leave to the right the French town of Chandernagore, thence follow the line of the railroad as far as Burdwan, and afterwards pass transversely through Bihar, so as to rejoin the Ganges at Benares. "Arrange the route exactly as you please, my friends," said Colonel Munro. "Decide without reference to me. Whatever you do will be done well." "Still, my dear Munro," replied Banks, "it would be satisfactory to have your opinion." "No, Banks," returned the colonel. "I give myself up to you, and have no wish to visit one place rather than another. One single question, however, I will ask. After Benares, in what direction do you propose to travel?" "Northwards, most certainly," exclaimed Hood impetuously. "Right across the kingdom of Oude, up to the lower ranges of the Himalayas." "Well then, my friends," began Colonel Munro, "perhaps when we get so far I will propose, but it will be soon enough to speak of that when the time comes. Till then, just go where you choose." I could not help feeling somewhat surprised by these words of Sir Edward Munro. What could he have in his mind? Had he only agreed to take this journey in the hope that chance might serve his purpose better than his own will and endeavour had done? Did it seem to him possible that, supposing Nana Sahib to be still alive, he might yet find trace of him in the extreme north of India? Was the hope of vengeance still strong within him? I could not resist the conviction that our friend was influenced by this hidden motive, and that Sergeant McNeill shared his master's thoughts. When we left Calcutta, we were seated in the drawing-room of Steam House. The door and the windows of the veranda were open, and the measured beat of the punkah kept up an agreeable temperature. Storr drove the engine at a slow and steady rate of 3 miles an hour, for we travellers were just then in no haste, and desired to see at leisure the country we passed through. For a long time we were followed by a number of Europeans who were astonished at our equipage, and by crowds of natives whose wonder and admiration was mingled with fear. We gradually distanced this attendant mob, but met people continually who lavished upon us admiring explanations of "Voila! Voila!" The huge elephant, vomiting clouds of steam, excited far more astonishment than the 2 superb cars which he drew after him. At 10 o'clock breakfast was served in the dining-room, and, seated at a table which was far less shaken than it would have been in a first-class railway carriage, we did ample justice to the culinary skill of Monsieur Parazal. We were travelling along the left bank of the Hooghly, the most western of the numerous arms of the Ganges, which form together the labyrinthine network of the delta of the Sundarbans, and is entirely an alluvial formation. "What you see there, my dear Maukler," said Banks, "is a conquest won by the sacred river Ganges from the not less sacred Bay of Bengal. It has been a mere affair of time. There is probably not an atom of that soil which has not been transported hither by the mighty current from the Himalayan heights. Little by little the stream has robbed the mountains in order to form this province, through which it has worked its bed—" "And changes incessantly," broke in Captain Hood. "There never was such a whimsical, capricious lunatic of a river as this same Ganges. People take the trouble to build a town on its banks, and behold, a few centuries later the town is in the midst of a plain, its harbors are dry, the river has changed its course. Thus Rajmahal as well as Gower were both formerly situated on this faithless stream, and now there they are dying of thirst amidst the parched rice-fields of the plains." "Then may not some such fate be in store for Calcutta?" inquired I. "Ah, who knows?" "Come, come," said Banks, "you forget the engineers. It would only require skilful embankments. We could easily put a strait waistcoat on the Ganges and restrain its vagaries." "It is well for you, Banks," said I, "that no natives are within earshot when you speak so irreverently of their sacred stream. They would never forgive you." "Well, really," returned Banks, "they look on their river as a son of God, if not God himself, and in their eyes it can do nothing amiss." "Not even by maintaining, as it does, epidemics of the plague, fever, and cholera," cried Captain Hood. "I must say, however, that the atmosphere it engenders agrees splendidly with the tigers and crocodiles which swarm in the Sundarbans. Ah, the savages! Fox," he added, turning to his servant, who was clearing away the breakfast things. "Yes, Captain." "Wasn't it there where you killed your 37th?" "Yes, Captain, 2 miles from Fort Canning. It was one evening—" "There, Fox, that will do," interrupted the captain, as he tossed off a large glass of brandy and soda. "I know all about the 37th. The history of your 38th would interest me more." "My 38th is not killed yet, Captain." "No, but you will bag him some day, Fox, as I shall my 41st. It is to be noted that in the conversations of Captain Hood and his men, the word tiger was never mentioned. It was quite unnecessary. The 2 hunters perfectly understood one another. As we proceeded to the Hooghly, its banks, which above Calcutta are rather low, gradually contracted, much reducing the width of the river. This part of the country is subject to formidable cyclones, which spread disaster far and wide. Whole districts wasted, hundreds of houses heaped one upon another, immense plantations devastated, thousands of corpses strewing the soil. Such is the ruin left behind when these fearful atmospheric disturbances sweep over the land, and of which the cyclone of 1864 was a most terrible example. It is well known that the climate of India is varied by 3 seasons: the rainy season, the cold season, and the hot season. The last is the shortest, but also the most trying. March, April, and May are months particularly to be dreaded. May is, above all these, the hottest, and those Europeans who then venture to face the noontide blaze of the sun do it at the risk of their lives. It is not unusual for the thermometer to rise in the shade to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. "Men are forced," writes M. de Valbezin, "to wheeze in breathing like broken-winded horses, and during the war both officers and soldiers were frequently obliged to dash water over their heads to prevent congestion of the brain." We did not, however, suffer from the heat, as besides the draught produced by the motion of our steam-house, the punkahs kept fanning into pleasant circulation the humid air which blew through the woven grass blinds stretched across our windows, and which were constantly watered. The rainy season, which lasts from June till October, was not far distant, and in some respects might prove more disagreeable than the hot months. But, luxuriously provided as we were, we had little to fear under any conditions of the atmosphere. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, having enjoyed a most agreeable drive at a gentle pace, we arrived at Chandernagore. I had already visited this little corner of territory, all that remains to France in the whole presidency of Bengal. Chandernagore, the ancient rival of Calcutta during the struggles of the 18th century, remains under the protection of the tricolored flag, but has no right to maintain a garrison of more than 15 men. The town is now fallen into decay. It is without trade, industry, or commerce. Its bazaars are deserted, its forts abandoned. If the Allahabad Railroad had at least passed outside its walls, Chandernagore might have recovered some vitality, but anticipating the demands of the French government, the English Railway Company took pains to distort the line so as to skirt our territory, and Chandernagore has thus lost her only chance of retrieving her fortunes and resuming some measure of commercial importance. We did not enter the town, but halted 3 miles off on the borders of a grove of palm trees. When our camp was pitched, one would have taken it for a rising young village, but being movable, it proceeded on its way early next morning, after a peaceful night during which we all slept soundly in our comfortable bedrooms. During the halt, Banks had attended to the supply of fuel. The engine did not consume much, but it was necessary to have on the tender sufficient water, wood, and coal to keep us going for 60 hours. This rule about keeping up the supply was carefully applied by Captain Hood and his faithful Fox to the maintenance of their own particular furnaces, that is to say, their stomachs, which in truth were always amply provided with the sort of fuel so necessary to keep up the powers of the human machine. The next stage was to be longer. By traveling for 2 days, stopping only during the night, we could reach Burdwan and visit that city on the 9th of May. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Storr sounded his shrill whistle, and the iron giant started at a more rapid rate than that of the preceding day. For some hours we kept near the railroad, which from Burdwan passes on to Rajmahal, in the valley of the Ganges, which it then follows till beyond Benares. The Calcutta train passed us at a great speed, and the shouts of the passengers showed that while they admired us, they mocked our slower pace. We did not return their defiance. More rapidly they certainly did travel than ourselves, but in comfort there was simply no comparison. During these 2 days the scenery was invariably flat and therefore monotonous. Here and there waved a few slender cocoanut trees, the last of which we should leave behind after passing Burdwan. These trees, which belong to the great family of palms, are partial to the coast, and love to breathe salt air. Thus they are not found beyond a somewhat narrow belt along the sea-coast, and it is vain to seek them in central India. The flora of the interior is, however, extremely interesting and varied. On each side of our route, the country in this part resembles an immense chessboard, marked out in squares of rice fields, and stretching as far as we could see. Shades of green predominated, and the harvest promised to be abundant in this moist, warm soil, the prodigious fertility of which is well known. On the evening of the second day, with punctuality which an express might have envied, the engine gave its last snort and stopped at the gates of Burdwan. This city is the judicial headquarters of an English district, but properly speaking, the country belongs to a Maharaja, who pays taxes to government amounting to not less than 10 millions. The town consists in a great part of low houses, standing in fine avenues of trees, such as cocoanuts and arequipas. These avenues being wide enough to admit our train, we proceeded to encamp in a charming spot full of shade and freshness. It seemed as though a large addition were suddenly made to the city when our houses took up their position in it, and we would not have exchanged our residences for any in the splendid quarter where stands the magnificent palace of the sovereign of Burdwan. It may well be supposed that our elephant produced all the terror and admiration which he usually excited among the Bengalis. The people ran together from all sides, the men bareheaded, their hair cut short à la Titus, and wearing only loose cotton drawers, while the women were enveloped from head to foot in white. "I begin to be afraid," said Captain Hood, "that the Maharajah will want to buy our behemoth, and that he will offer such a vast sum we shall be forced to let his Highness have him." "Never!" exclaimed Binks. "I will make another elephant for him if he likes, of power enough to draw his whole capital from one end of his dominion to the other. But we won't part with Behemoth at any price, will we, Munro?" "Most certainly we will not," answered the colonel, in the tone of a man who was not to be tempted by millions. And after all, there was no question as to whether our colossal elephant was for sale or not. The Maharajah was not at Burdwan, and the only visit we received was from his Kamdar, a sort of private secretary, who came to examine our equipage. Having done so, this personage offered us permission, which we very readily accepted, to examine the gardens of the palace. We found them well worth a visit. They were beautifully laid out, filled with the finest specimens of tropical vegetation, and watered by sparkling rivulets flowing from miniature lakes. The park we also admired greatly. Its verdant lawns were adorned by fanciful kiosks, and in the superb menageries we found specimens of all the animals of the country, wild as well as domestic. Here were goats, stags, deer, elephants, tigers, lions, panthers, and bears, besides others too numerous to mention. "Oh, Captain," cried Fox, "here are tigers in cages just like birds. Isn't it a pity?" "Indeed, Fox, and so it is," replied the captain. "If the poor fellows had their choice, they certainly would far rather be prowling about in the jungle, even within reach of our rifle balls." "That's just what I think, Captain," sighed honest Fox. Next morning, the 10th of May, having laid in a fresh stock of provisions, we quitted Burdwan. Our steam house passed the line of railroad by a level crossing, and travelled in the direction of Ramgur, a town situated about 70 leagues from Calcutta. It is true that by pursuing this route we left several places unvisited, as, for instance, the important town of Morshedabad, which is not interesting, either in its native or European aspect; Mongir, a sort of Hindu Birmingham, perched on a high promontory overhanging the course of the sacred river; and Patna, the capital of the kingdom of Bihar, through which we intended to pass obliquely. This city seems almost smothered in the creeping plants which so abound in its neighborhood as to invade its walls and houses on all sides. It is the wealthy center of the opium trade. But we had a greater objective in view, and therefore followed a more southern route, about 2 degrees below the valley of the Ganges. During this part of the journey Behemoth was kept going at a gentle trot, which pace proved the excellent structure of our well-hung carriages. The roads being good also favored our experiment. To the great surprise of Captain Hood, we passed through many jungles without seeing any wild animals. It seemed not unlikely that they were terrified, and fled at the approach of a gigantic elephant, vomiting steam and smoke. But as it was to the northern regions, and not to Bengal provinces, that our hunter looked for the sport he loved so well, he did not as yet begin to complain. On the 15th of May we were near Ramgur, about 50 leagues from Burdwan. The rate of speed at which we had travelled was not more than 15 leagues in 12 hours. 3 days afterward, on the 18th, we stopped at the little town of Chitra. No incidents marked these stages of our journey. The heat was intense, but what could be more agreeable than a siesta beneath the cool shelter of the verandas? The burning hours passed away in luxurious repose. In the evenings, Storr and Calouth cleaned the furnace and oiled and thoroughly examined the engines, operations which were always carefully superintended by Binks himself. While he was so employed, Captain Hood and I, accompanied by Fox, Gomy, and the 2 dogs, used to take our guns and explore the neighborhood of our camp. We fell in with nothing more important in the way of game than birds and a few small animals, and although the captain turned up his nose at such poor sport, he was always highly delighted the next day when Monsieur Perizard regaled us with a variety of new and savory dishes. Banks, when he could, made our halting places near some wood and on the banks of a stream or brook, because it was always necessary to replenish the tender with what was wanted for the next day's journey, and he attended personally to every detail. Gomy and Fox were frequently employed as hewers of wood and drawers of water. When the day's work was done, we lighted our cigars, excellent Manila cheroots, and while we smoked, we talked about this country with which Hood, as well as Banks, was so thoroughly well acquainted. The captain disdained cigars, and his vigorous lungs inhaled, through a pipe 20 feet long, the aromatic smoke of a hookah, carefully filled for him by the hand of Fox. It was our greatest wish that Colonel Munro should accompany us on our little shooting excursions round the camp. We invariably asked him to do so, but he as invariably declined, and remained with Sergeant McNeill, spending the time of our absence in pacing up and down a distance of not more than 100 yards. They spoke little, but so completely did they understand one another that words were not needed for the interchange of thoughts. Both were absorbed in tragic and indelible recollections. It was possible that, in approaching the theatre of the bloody insurrection, these recollections would become more vivid. Banks and Captain Hood shared with me the opinion that some fixed idea, which would be developed later, had induced Colonel Munro to join us in the expedition to the north of India. In that case we might be on the verge of great events. Our steam behemoth might be drawing us across these huge plains and mountains to the scene of a thrilling and unexpected drama. End of Chapter 6. Recording by C.L.W. Rollins, Dallas, Texas.